This is Drew with Boomer Music Company, your band and orchestra experts since 1976.
Goals of the presentation present the audience with what started swing and present core musicians and how their ideas co-mingled to create swing music, and present the musicians and bands that started swing music and why its popularity ended. I'm Kevin Bollinger with the Hot Tomatoes Dance Orchestra. What is swing? When Benny Goodman made his first radio broadcast in 1935, he couldn't possibly have known that his music would change America and the world forever. The music was called swing, but what is swing? It can be related to the human body, the rhythm of the heart, even walking, or dancing. The swing era, generally from 1935 to approximately 1947, couldn't have happened without the effect swing has on humans and the way it makes us feel. The swing era sparked the first youth cultural revolution. It was all about dancing, and without dance, the swing era never would have occurred. At its most basic, swing music is the mix of orchestrated big band music and jazz improvisation. It has endured for nearly 100 years with many known icons. It is still current today, especially with the dance community of younger people who first got to know about swing from the mid-90s movie Swing Kids. That movie spurred on a new cultural revolution among many younger people who wanted to learn how to dance to swing and learn steps that their grandparents likely used. There are current stars that have been very successful with the style of music: Michael Bublé, Harry Connick Jr., Brian Setzer, the Royal Crown Review, and Robbie Williams, who produced the swing album that went platinum 7 times over. Much of the credit for the beginnings of the swing era goes to Benny Goodman. Almost single-handedly, his band in 1935 made people aware of the music from his radio shows and his famous 1935 tour. During that tour, much of the country was not impressed with this new music called swing. Instead, the public was after foxtrots and waltzes that they were already familiar with and felt that swing was too much, too loud. Even in Denver, at the Trocadero Ballroom at Elitch's, the band was unsuccessful with its new music. It is said that the only people in the audience were friends of the musicians. In fact, a former bass player with my band, the Hot Tomatoes Dance Orchestra, was there as his wife had given birth and was in the hospital. Our great friend Al Brisson bragged that he danced with Gene Krupa's wife. Benny almost wanted to give up the tour, but was convinced to finish it and head to the West Coast. In Los Angeles, at the Palomar Ballroom, the music became a hit. The younger people in LA had been listening to Benny Goodman's radio show out of New York City called Let's Dance. That show was on too late for many in the Eastern, Central, and even Mountain time zones too. But on the West Coast, people were listening to the show, and younger people especially were enthralled with this new music called swing. The Palomar was a huge dance hall, perhaps the biggest in the West. An estimated 10,000 people showed up to hear the Goodman Band. This occurred on August 21st, 1935, and can be considered the inauguration or start of the swing era. Word got out, especially from young people, that you needed to go see and dance to the Benny Goodman Band. Even as Goodman has been credited with swing music, its origins go much further back. You have to go back to the 1920s. Much of what swing is about race. Although slavery had been abolished for 60 years, there remained segregation in not only how and where people lived, but also in the music scene. What white and black listened to was different. White music developed from foxtrots and polkas. Black music was mostly derived from Africa and the jazz music in New Orleans. New Orleans was a special city where many different backgrounds, African, French, Native American, started melding together. But in the years after World War I, both white and black thirsted for fun, and that meant dancing. King of the white dance bands was Paul Whiteman. By the way, Paul Whiteman was the supervisor of the Department of Music at the Denver Public Schools from 1888 to 1924. But during this time, most bands were smaller bands playing variations of Dixieland or traditional jazz. His was really the first large band that featured current stars in Bick Spiderbeck and Bing Crosby, and many future stars such as Hokie Carmichael, Tommy Dorsey, and others. His smooth band was perfect for hotel music for a generation that wanted to dance the Charleston and forget the horrors of the First World War. One of Whiteman's chief collaborators was George Gershwin, who would write numbers for the band, including Rhapsody in Blue, which Whiteman commissioned. This was one of the first pieces of symphonic jazz and a staple in the repertoire of classical music. Whiteman's band drew on jazz, but also from classical music. What Paul Whiteman's band didn't have was the wild improvisations of jazz music. For jazz improvisation, you have to go to New Orleans, where traditional jazz was humming along. One of its most important and influential musicians was Louis Armstrong. It is not really known what specifically influenced Armstrong in his style. It is said that he may have heard another great trumpeter named Buddy Bolden, who was highly regarded in the New Orleans music circles. However, Buddy Bolden was never recorded, so we don't know what he sounded like. The home of music in New Orleans was Storyville, and Louis had a job delivering coal to that community. He was able to hear the best music in New Orleans at that time just by doing his day job. Many gigs were in places of ill repute, such as brothels and bars, and Louis's proficiency with his instrument allowed him to play what he had heard without difficulty. Armstrong, more than anyone else, provided the inspiration for swing. In 1923, Paul Whiteman was one of a good number of musicians who heard Louis play in King Oliver's band in Chicago. Armstrong's showbiz personality makes it easy to forget that he was one of the greatest trumpet players ever seen. He is really the main innovator in jazz with his improvisations that nobody else had yet mastered. As a boy, he first learned to play drums. That is significant as he was already so strong with rhythm by the time he picked up the trumpet. And rhythm is what is essential in swing music. As Duke Ellington put it don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing. The pulse and rhythm coming from Armstrong's early works is really the basis for swing. In 1924, Armstrong's New Orleans sound was about to change the course of 20th century popular music. He was going to team up with the foremost band in New York City, led by Fletcher Henderson, who was mesmerized by Armstrong and what he was playing. Fletcher had remarked to other musicians that he had heard Louis Armstrong in Chicago and that Armstrong could really swing. This is believed to be the first time swing was used to describe music. Fletcher Henderson's band was the hottest band in New York. When Louis came to play, many of the musicians didn't think much of him at first, calling him a country boy. That was until Louis started to play. This collaboration can be considered the first swing band. Jazz music at this time was played and not written. Fletcher Henderson wrote down the music that heretofore had not been written. His arrangements, along with his lead saxophone player Don Redmond and his brother Horace's arrangements, melded together the sounds of a large band with jazz improvisation. This can be considered the first swing band all the way back in 1924. These arrangements were the beginning of a swing formula that keeps sound moving. One section playing the melody, while other sections backing them up, or riffs and shouts often under an improvisation. Most of what was occurring in the New York neighborhood of Harlem. Harlem was a mecca at the time that allowed Black people freedom to carry on with their lives, their jobs, without the fear of discrimination. There was stimulation of ideas and culture that helped others come to the forefront. One of these was Duke Ellington. He was born to a middle-class family in Washington, D.C., and moved to New York in 1923. When he heard Fletcher Henderson's band with its complex interplay between instruments and great improvisation, he knew that swing would be the new framework for his more refined style of music. He really discovered how to blend the refined and the raw perfectly. Duke knew how to write music for various musicians in his band, from Bubber Miley and later Cootie Williams on trumpet, to Johnny Hodges, Ben Webster, Harry Carney on saxophone, and Tricky Sam Nanton on trombone. Ellington played frequently at the Cotton Club in Harlem. This club was ruled with an iron fist by mobster types. No talking was allowed at all during performances. If someone was talking during a performance, they would eventually be ushered out of the club or potentially worse. Another notable entertainer at the Cotton Club was, of course, Cab Calloway. In 1929, Cab relocated to New York City from Baltimore. He already had a band that toured the South called the Alabamans. That band also moved to New York with Cab, and he spent many years entertaining at the Cotton Club. Occasionally, there would be fantastic dancers joining him there, the Nicholas Brothers in later years. Although the Nicholas Brothers were more known for tap dancing, there is no doubt that swing music and dancing, or tapping in this case, is intertwined. The video that I've bookmarked surely was not in the Cotton Club, as the audience was mostly Black, but it is an excellent example nonetheless of moving to swing music featuring the Nicholas Brothers. During the 1920s and early 1930s, the most popular dance in the white community was the Charleston. Black dancers took the Charleston and changed a few dance steps and created the Lindy Hop. The Lindy Hop was one of the most popular dances to bands playing swing and still is to this day. Many current dance clubs have Lindy Hop lessons, the most notable being the Mercury Cafe in downtown Denver. Dancers pay a single price at the door. As part of that entry fee, they get dance lessons from some of the best young dancers in the Denver area. After the dance lessons, they get to try out what they learned with live bands. While teenagers were driving the swing phenomena in the swing era, mostly due to the popularity of Benny Goodman, other white bands such as Artie Shaw's and Tommy Dorsey's band were soon hits as well, not only in dance halls, radio and records, but also in movies. White teenagers were aware of the most popular form of dance, the Lindy Hop, mostly used in the Black community. However, they changed a few steps, and the dance was known as the jitterbug. The jitterbug was far less a formal dance than the six-step Lindy Hop, and it was quite a bit wilder to look at. Parents of the day had never seen young women move this way, and they were already horrified with swing music and the Black origins of it. In fact, dance critics called white jitterbug as uncouth to look at, lacking the control of the Lindy Hop, and generally lacking control, for the jitterbug had many variations. This really became a new phenomenon with the mass of youth culture and the new music called swing. Swing was more than music for the teenagers embracing it. It offered a way of life, music, a code of dress, even a language. It was the world's first youth culture. Band leaders were the pop stars of the day, featured in magazines and even what they were wearing. The most famous dance troupe of the day in the swing era was Whitey's Lindy Hoppers. This group and many others made their home in the Savoy Ballroom in Harlem. Other notable dancers at that time were Shorty George Snowden, who had his own posse in a corner of the Savoy. Also, Bill Robinson, who went by the nickname Bojangles. What is notable about Shorty George and Bill Robinson is that tunes were actually composed for both those dancers. Shorty George by the Count Basie Orchestra, and Bojangles, a tribute to Bill Robinson, by the Duke Ellington Orchestra. So surely the swing era was dependent on dancers, and the dancers depended on the great swing bands of the day. The dancers who frequented the Savoy Ballroom in Harlem were, of course, the Black community, although whites were not excluded. What a difference from the Cotton Club, where even though it was in Harlem, Blacks were not permitted to enter, only to entertain. The Black community took dancing to heart, frequently rehearsing almost every day when they could to be the best dancers to swing music in the world. Those dancers then went to the Savoy Ballroom to show off their moves. One thing to keep in mind is that the swing era and the beginnings of it in the early to mid-1930s occurred during the Depression. Only the best crowd-drawing bands could survive due to the economic realities of this time. And many people wanted sweet music at this time and slow dancing. The Depression's economic woes started hitting up-and-coming Black musicians such as Fletcher Henderson. Fletcher was forced to sell some of his arrangements in order to survive. Some of these went to a newer, fabulous clarinet player named Benny Goodman. Benny was a great clarinet player who had played with many different groups in the 1920s, Paul Whiteman and others. Once he got his hands on the arrangements of Fletcher Henderson, his band really took off. One of the most well-known arrangements was King Porter's Stomp that Fletcher arranged. Benny had really good players in his band, Bunny Berrigan, Harry James, and others, and his recording of King Porter's Stomp was a hit. So Benny's band was surely indebted to a Black man, Fletcher Henderson, for its sound during the swing era. In Goodman's hands, swing would become mainstream and be the soundtrack for the first sightings of an American teenager revolution, a full 20 years before rock and roll. Benny spent a lot of time in Harlem and flipped out when he heard Teddy Wilson and Lionel Hampton and hired those musicians immediately. Goodman might have been colorblind, but America was not. The Depression had caused a lot of dance clubs to close, and radio became the way the American public could still hear jazz and swing. Racial prejudice had stopped Duke Ellington from having a radio show across the country. But Benny Goodman had no restrictions as a white clarinet player and was the jazz band on NBC's national radio show called Let's Dance, starting in 1934. This radio show was important as many clubs had closed during the Depression due to a lack of people coming to them. The only way to get jazz or swing to the American public was via the radio. When Goodman started touring across the country, he could not use the Black musicians in his band that were on the radio show due to the current issues with race in the country at that time, and had to replace those players with white musicians. In later years, Benny would keep Teddy Wilson and Lionel Hampton around in a smaller group he had. At times, he would also add the phenomenal Duke Ellington trumpet player Cootie Williams to this group. After Benny's successful 1935 tour and many tours after that, he came back to Harlem and visited the Savoy Ballroom in the spring of 1937. The house band at the Savoy was the Chick Webb Band. Chick was a diminutive man who suffered many health crises in his life, but was a fabulous drummer and band leader. On May 11th, 1937, there was a battle of the bands between the so-called King of Swing, Benny Goodman, and Chick Webb's band. Chick wanted to win this so bad that he told his players, "If any of you miss a note, don't bother coming back." Chick's band cleaned Goodman's clock that night and was the clear winner for the dancers who attended. Chick played many tunes that Goodman was famous for, such as Don't Be That Way, but with different arrangements. Chick's band was hotter. In fact, Gene Krupa stared in disbelief at Chick Webb when Chick Webb's band played. Krupa stated, "That night when we battled Chick at the Savoy, he just cut me to ribbons, made me feel awfully small. That man was dynamic. He could reach the most amazing heights. When he really let go, you had a feeling that the entire atmosphere in the place was being charged. When he felt like it, he could cut down any of us." 8 months later, a crazy thing happened. Carnegie Hall had the first jazz concert featuring the Benny Goodman Band. Jazz had never before been performed in this great concert hall, known for terrific performances of classical music. This performance on January 16th, 1938, was the first time that jazz, hard-swinging, uncompromised jazz, took the stage and further legitimized the art form. Also notable at this event were black and white musicians playing together. For included in Benny's performance were black stars, Count Basie and Duke Ellington. There were different sized ensembles and even a Dixieland band. But Count Basie had to leave early, for you see, his band was going up to Harlem to battle Chick Webb in the Savoy Ballroom later that night. Many of Benny's players went to the Savoy, revisiting the room where they had been cut to ribbons not even a year ago, to see how Count Basie would fare against Chick Webb. It was widely considered that the battle was a draw. No one clearly won that night. Count had some very hot numbers his band would play, such as Shout and Feel It. There's a link for Shout and Feel It in the PowerPoint slides you should listen to. The mass audience that Benny Goodman brought to swing also benefited African-American bands such as Count Basie and others. A slightly different form of swing came out of the Southwest, Kansas City, Oklahoma, even Omaha. The only place that didn't suffer from the Depression was Kansas City. Kansas City was run by a mayor who allowed the city to be wide open. It was run by the rackets. Bill Basie, later known as Count, was born in Red Bank, New Jersey, not too far from New York City. He had studied with the fabulous stride pianist James P. Johnson. Count hit the road with the group, backing up a vaudeville show. When they got to Kansas City, the band ran out of money and broke up. Count was stranded a long ways from his home base. In Kansas City, he met Fats Waller. Waller taught Basie how to play the organ, and Count started playing in theaters in Kansas City, backing up silent movies. Count also ventured to Tulsa, Oklahoma at some point and heard a territory band there. Territory bands were lesser-known bands who had certain territories they played in. Many towns had theaters and dance halls where these bands would play, and then they would hit the road for the next town. In fact, Charlie Parker's first gigs were with the J. McShann Territory Band based in Kansas City in 1938. But Basie heard a different band in Tulsa named Walter Page and his famous Blue Devils in 1928. A few months later, Count was invited to join this band that played mostly in Oklahoma and Texas. Many members of this band, including the leader Walter Page, were in Count's first band in Kansas City, including the great vocalist Jimmy Rushing. In 1929, Count joined Benny Moten's band, which was based in Kansas City. This was a step up from the territory bands. This band featured two pianists, Count and Moten. Moten's ambition was to have a band similar to Duke Ellington's and Fletcher Henderson's bands. While the Blue Devils were known for more bluesy themes, Moten's band was more refined, playing in the Kansas City Stomp style. Along with hiring Count Basie to play, Moten also hired the leader of the Blue Devils, Walter Page. This changed Moten's sound considerably, as Page played 4-beat bass. This was opposed to the tuba that was used earlier, playing only 2-beat. 4-beat bass is very symptomatic of the swing sound that most every band used during the swing era and is still used today. On April 2nd, 1935, Benny Moten's band was in Denver at the Rainbow Ballroom without Benny. Count Basie was the only piano player that night. Benny was back in Kansas City having surgery for a tonsillectomy. Unfortunately, Benny Moten did not survive that surgery. Moten's band went back to Kansas City and basically was never led or heard from again. They tried to make a go of it, but they could not. Instead, Count Basie started his own band, originally called Barons of Rhythm. He did recruit many members from the Benny Moten band, including Walter Page, Jimmy Rushing, Joe Jones, the drummer, and Freddie Green, the great guitar player who stayed with Basie until the end. This was considered the best rhythm section anywhere and played with a floating type of feel that allowed Count and the band to play easily over them. They played at the Reno Club in Kansas City and sometimes were broadcast live. In fact, during one of these broadcasts, the band was ready to play another tune, and the radio announcer asked what tune it was. Well, Count looked up at the clock and saw it was close to 1 a.m. So he told the announcer the tune was the 1 o'clock jump. Its real name was not fit for radio. The original name of this tune was entitled Blue Ball, a little too risque for the radio and certainly too risque for your average family with children. In 1936, John Hammond, who was a talent scout and record producer and had worked with many different well-known groups, including Benny Goodman, heard the broadcast from the Reno Club in Kansas City. Count's band went to Chicago for a while and had a steady gig there, and also recorded for John Hammond. John Hammond commented that this session was the only perfect, completely perfect recording session he ever had anything to do with. Count then moved to New York, where he actually had to increase the size of his band. In Kansas City and Chicago, it had 3 brass and 3 reeds. He had to increase the size in order to play for shows in New York that demanded a bigger band. Many influential musicians played with Count, including Sweets Edison, Buck Clayton, and later Lester Prez Young. In later years, when not on tour and in New York City, Count Basie would play at a club called Birdland, the same club where the revolutionary saxophone player Charlie Parker played. New York City became the epicenter for swing music. It had progressed and matured with the improvisation of Louis Armstrong, the sophistication of Ellington, and the rhythm of Count Basie. Plus, a new generation of extraordinary vocalists was beginning to make a mark on the music in the 1930s. Billie Holiday with Count Basie, Peggy Lee with Benny Goodman, Ella Fitzgerald with Chick Webb, and later leading that band, and Frank Sinatra with Artie Shaw and Tommy Dorsey. The publishers of the music had insisted on words, so singers were featured more now than before. They had been with bands back in the 20s, but were more featured now. The leaders didn't particularly like the singers, considering them a necessary evil, and had to have them in order to keep publishing their music. The singers were not like what we hear today. They generally sang a chorus in the middle of the song and didn't often end the song. Billie Holiday wanted to leave Count Basie's band. Oftentimes, they were dressed in Aunt Jemima-style clothes. She had a talk with Artie Shaw, who convinced her to join his band in New York. However, there were still issues with racial prejudice. Billie was forced to not use the main elevator in the hotel, as some of the patrons complained and caused great concern for that hotel. The hotel asked Artie if Billie could use a freight elevator. When Artie asked Billie, she refused. Soon after, she never went on the road with the swing band again. Some of the tunes that Billie wrote or co-wrote were banned from radio, such as Strange Fruit, a song about the lynchings of Black men in the American South. Norma Dolores Eggstrom, known as Peggy Lee, was brought up in North Dakota. She sang professionally in the Dakotas and across the Midwest. Benny Goodman turned up at a club in Chicago where she was singing, as he was looking for a replacement for Helen Forrest. Peggy said he was looking at her strangely, but really he was excited about her singing and probably thinking how it would work on his band. She joined Benny in the early 1940s and had a big hit with Why Don't You Do Right? Benny had a rule on his band that none of his players could fraternize with the singers. It's a smart idea to keep a band together. But Benny's guitar player fell for Peggy, and Peggy fell for him. True to his rule, Benny fired the guitar player, and Peggy quit almost immediately. In later years, when big bands from the swing era were unable to continue due to economics and the growing popularity of bebop, Peggy recorded Why Don't You Do Right Again, but only with the four-piece rhythm section. Just not the same as with Benny's full band. Ella Fitzgerald was a frequent visitor to the Savoy Ballroom, seeing the Chick Webb Band and others. She was trying her hand at singing and was in some amateur singing competitions at the Apollo Theater. She won the chance to sing for a week with the Tiny Bradshaw Band at the Harlem Opera House. There she met Chick Webb, and while Chick was reluctant to sign her because of her disheveled and gawky looks, he gave her a chance to sing with the band at Yale University. She was met with approval from both the audience and Chick's band members and started regularly working with Chick Webb at the Savoy. She had a couple of hit songs, but the one that really sparked her career was A Tisket, a Tasket. Being so young, she had a young voice that wasn't quite mature enough to pull off romantic numbers. But a nursery rhyme like A Tisket, which she co-wrote, worked quite well. Webb died in 1939, and Ella took over the band for a while. During the next couple of years, the band had a hard time surviving economically. Ella left the band and started a long series of solo work with other groups, and the rest is magnificent musical history. Frank Sinatra came up singing in various joints and so-called amateur hours in his native New Jersey and New York City. He scored a gig at a roadhouse in Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey. Despite the low salary, Sinatra thought this was the break he was looking for and boasted that he was going to become so big that nobody could touch him. In March 1939, Sinatra recorded some songs for the Dance Parade. Harry James heard Frank on those recordings and broadcasts and quickly hired him to sing with Harry's band. But Frank was not too thrilled singing with the Harry James Band, and in November of 1939, he joined Tommy Dorsey's band. This was a great match. Dorsey stated that you could almost feel the excitement from the crowd when the kids stood up to sing. Frank worked with Tommy Dorsey for a couple of years and later also worked with the great clarinet player Artie Shaw's band. After working with some of the best swing bands, Frank went solo. Last but not least is Glenn Miller. Glenn was born in Clarinda, Iowa, and moved with his family to Fort Morgan, Colorado when he was 3 years old. So he is what I've heard called a semi-native. He attended the University of Colorado in Boulder, but wasn't much of a student. He actually received some failing grades in music theory, which is actually quite shocking. Glenn left CU and started working with a number of other bands, Ben Pollock and Victor Young. When Young hired Jack Teagarden, Miller found that his solos were cut drastically. Miller also joined Red Nichols and eventually Tommy Dorsey in 1934 to 1935. He also worked with the British swing band led by Ray Noble, where he developed the arrangement of lead clarinet over 4 saxophones. That would become his signature sound. In 1937, Miller started off with his own band, but he failed to distinguish his band from many other bands and eventually broke the band up in January of 1938. He was dejected and asked Benny Goodman, how do you do it? How do you make it? Then he said, I don't know, Glenn. You just stick with it. Eventually, Glenn formed a new band, the famous band that we all know, in 1939. That band continued on to 1942, where Miller decided to join the Army in preparation of World War II. He was actually too old to join at age 38 and convinced the Army to be placed in charge of a modernized Army band. This was a great success for the Army and Glenn, and led to well-known compositions, St. Louis Blues March, American Patrol. Glenn entertained the troops at home and in Europe. He was to play for the American troops who had liberated France in Paris, but the night before, his airplane disappeared over the English Channel. After World War II, the big swing bands had a difficult time making it, often devolving into smaller groups. The popularity of the singers that had been stars with the big bands also contributed to their demise. The American public was more interested in the singers themselves rather than the complete band. An example is Frank Sinatra. Of course, Frank was very famous from movies and his singing. When the center of jazz basically moved from New York to Los Angeles in the mid to late 50s, arrangers were made to conceive of arrangements to back up singers rather than arrangements for swing or big bands that included singers. The best example of this is Frank's recordings at Capitol Records, where his primary arranger was Nelson Riddle. Nelson was a trombone player on Tommy Dorsey's band before the war, but now is relegated to writing absolutely fantastic arrangements to back up Frank Sinatra and other singers, by the way. So the great swing bands were basically born in the 20s and 30s, but died off after World War II. Only a couple of leaders were able to keep these bands going. Count Basie's Resurrected Band in the mid to late 50s, and Duke Ellington's band. In fact, Duke had to pay his band out of the royalties he received for his compositions. There will always be a niche for swing bands, but never again will they be the way of popular music or work on a regular basis. I'm Kevin Bollinger. Thanks for listening.
If you need help with instruments, repairs, sheet music, or anything band or orchestra, reach out to us at boomermusiccompany.com. And if you like what you hear, do me a favor and tell a friend. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Facebook, and subscribe to our e-newsletter so you will never miss another video or podcast. This is Drew with Boomer Music Company. Thank you for listening.